So what I'm going to speak about today is drawn from my new book project on Asian immigrants and the hidden history of Ellis Island. So the Ellis Island is well known as the United States' largest immigration station, starting with its opening in 1892 and ending with large-scale European immigration in 1924. However, especially from 1924 until 1954, when the station was actually closed, Ellis Island was, according to Harper's Weekly, America's chief deportation depot. Some of the major groups being detained at and deported through New York were Asian. This included Asian stowaways and jump ship sailors. And it's not, I don't think it's as widely known as it should be, but the crews of ships working not only in the Pacific but also in the Atlantic were very substantially Asian crews. So for example, in 1908, when 30,000 sailors entered US ports, almost half of them traveled through New York. And also, in addition to sailors and stowaways and jump ship sailors, also Japanese nationals who were interned on Ellis Island under the enemy alien program during World War II. And finally, Chinese New Yorkers, who are the focus of my paper today. So although Ellis Island has been associated with European immigration and Angel Island in San Francisco with Asian exclusion, New York officials were extensively involved in administering exclusion laws. There was a Chinese division in New York. It was formed in 1882 when the first Chinese exclusion law was passed, and 10 years before Ellis Island was built. And the division handled the entry, exclusion, and deportation of Chinese. So Angel Island had the largest numbers of arriving Asian immigrants. Until the 1920s, about sort of 50 to 70% of all Chinese arrived in San Francisco, while at that point less than 1% actually landed in New York. However, this number dropped as other entry points became more significant. So in New York, after the 1920s, there was about 7% of all Chinese immigrants came through New York. And there were also, as I said before, sort of other groups who aren't always considered immigrants, like sailors who are traveling extensively through New York. So although New York had fewer Chinese immigrants than San Francisco, it had much higher rates of arrests and deportations. As deportation policies were being introduced in the 1890s, the head of the Chinese division in New York noted that in contrast to San Francisco, where the Chinese community was so large it was difficult to control, quote, "The Chinese colonies in Boston, Philadelphia, and New York are not too large to be under strict police control." During the early 1900s, arrests of Chinese immigrants in the southern and eastern judicial districts of New York, which include New York City, were not only higher than arrests nationally, the numbers of arrests nationally, but they also led more frequently to deportation. Deportation statutes were used to maintain what Daniel Canstrom has called post-entry social control. And so I'm a historian, but I teach in James Madison College, where students care a lot about the sort of contemporary relevance, contemporary policies. And I think it's really important for us to think about how these sort of policies that were being developed at this time relate to our present immigration situation, but also to think about how the narratives of sort of who we are as a nation and what role a place like Ellis Island plays in that understanding, how those historical narratives also relate to our understanding of ourselves today. So in 1908, for example, New York City police officers made 63 arrests for disorderly conduct in the harbor precinct. And consistent with the large number of Asian sailors in New York, more than a third of the people detained were Chinese. However, while the non-Chinese received a substantial $75 fine, the Chinese arrestees were deported. During the 1920s, as larger numbers of Chinese settled in the New York area and as the Tong Wars flared up again, deportation was expanded. US immigration officials and New York City police officers worked together to raid Chinatown using immigration laws to deport those believed to be involved in Tongs. These large-scale raids coincided with Ellis Island's transformation from an immigration station to a detention center. In 1925, federal officials investigated more than 1,200 Chinese in New York and led a series of raids as part of a roundup of undesirables, sorry, this is their quote, I should say, a roundup of undesirables in Chinatown and its environs. At least 600 were seized in just one raid, and 256 of those individuals were ordered deported. Groups of detainees were escorted by officials to Chinatown to collect their belongings, paraded through the enclave, and then taken to Ellis Island to await their deportation. And many Chinatown residents were actually, they were troubled by the Tong Wars, but they also expressed concern that these constant raids in the 1920s would decimate and even lead to the end of the enclave. By 1924, the Commissioner General of Immigration noted that, quote, "The deportation of aliens is rapidly becoming one of the most important functions of the immigration service." And at that time, deportation was only for a period of 1 year. So, for example, when 3 Chinese stowaways were deported back to Guantanamo, Cuba, the officials said they were, quote, "not to be returned to the United States within 1 year." However, by 1929, expulsion was made permanent. Any person who was deported from the United States for any reason could never return. At this time, Ellis Island had sleeping and dining accommodations for up to 2,000 detainees. By the 1930s, it was not uncommon for these facilities to be filled overnight with immigrants. And many of these individuals, so many of the people coming in who were being detained were actually arriving immigrants, and their cases ultimately may have been approved, and they may have been allowed to enter. But also, others were waiting for deportation. And Chinese were overrepresented in those numbers of people awaiting deportation because they typically, they both waited longer to gain entry, so they were actually sort of, in terms of what they call sort of days, they were overrepresented when they came in, but they were also sort of took longer actually to be deported because they fought against their deportation very effectively. So they were sort of detained on the island for as little as a few hours, as long as 3 years. At least as early as 1934, Chinese were assigned segregated dormitories. A map of the island shows 2 dormitory rooms reserved for Chinese, 2 reserved for whites, and 1 room for, quote, colored immigration cases. Although most detainees were not Asian, Chinese arrivals held on Ellis Island in the 1930s remember their dormitory being full. And by 1944, when large numbers of enemy alien Japanese were also being detained on the island, the Chinese section included Japanese, South Asians, and other non-Europeans. However, it always remained segregated from other groups. So I've given you some of that history and some of that background, and as I was sort of thinking about this, I was thinking in some ways this symposium is about the sort of humanist perspective within migration studies. And I was trained actually in the American Culture program at University of Michigan, where Dr. Al-Sitani is a professor, but I was sort of trained in ethnic studies very centrally, and then also sort of history and somewhat of a more social science approach, and then also the humanities approach. So in addition to sort of all of the percentages of people arriving and being detained and deported and so on, I wanted just to sort of think about how this does relate to these sort of larger narratives, right, that we tell about immigration, and specifically about this iconic immigration station, Ellis Island, which often stands in for sort of, historically, for sort of immigration writ large in the United States. I think, so there's a few things I think are really important about this. First of all is that it's important for us to understand that Ellis Island is not only a site of European immigration, but long-standing migration from a broad range of groups, just as this has been part of the history of the United States broadly as well. And also that people's lives and residences are not as neatly divided as we typically assume, because most of the immigrants, the Asian immigrants arriving at Ellis Island, some of them were actually sailors who were either taking shore leave or were jumping ship. And then if they ended up in Ellis Island, that was actually because they were picked up and were being deported or reshipped foreign, they called it. But also a lot of the people who were arriving legally were Asians who had lived in Europe, who were doing business in Europe, like stone merchants and quite elite merchants, students studying at the sort of elite universities and boarding schools across Europe, who were also many people who lived in the Caribbean, right? So this sort of sense that Asians only arrive in the United States on the West Coast, I think, is really important for us to disrupt. And then also to think about how, as migration historians, the only kinds of groups of people we need to study are people who are legally defined as immigrants. And absolutely now, I think, there's a lot more scholarship around, obviously, undocumented immigrants, including the sort of long history of unauthorized immigration in the United States. But there are also like groups like sailors, for example, who don't necessarily want to stay permanently in the United States. They're sort of taking shore leave and they're just sort of interested in stopping off. And so rethinking how we think about sort of migration and movement. So it's not always, as I think immigration historians tend to think about, like this permanent settlement from your home country to your new country. And that's very fixed and settled. And in fact, starting in 1917, I mean, the Immigration Bureau, it didn't pull out the numbers of immigrants, but it recorded an average of like 8,000 Chinese, 3,500 Japanese, 3,000 Filipinos in Pacific Island, 2,000 South Asians who arrived in New York and didn't necessarily want to settle permanently, but they were on sort of what were called transit permits. So some of them were just traveling through the United States because they were going from Europe to Asia. Other people clearly wanted to kind of use this transit permit to settle permanently and sort of, were just using this as a way to get in the country. There were people I found who were just, some people coming to Hawaiian, the Princess of Hawaii, who was actually studying in London, who came to speak to US officials about the US occupation of Hawaii. But then also people who were just coming as tourists, right, to the United States for various reasons. So I think it's important for us to think about the multiplicity of ways that people are moving. And finally, I think it's just very important for us to think about Ellis Island not only as a place of immigration, but also of detention and deportation. So one history of the station states that after 1920, quote, after 1924, immigration slowed to a trickle and Ellis Island fell into disuse. It was closed in 1954. This closure was not caused by the end of large-scale European immigration. It was precipitated by the end of Chinese exclusion in 1943, the conclusion of enemy alien detention in 1948, and the end of racial quotas in 1952. In 1965, when Lyndon Bird Johnson signed the 1965 Immigration Act, which ended racial quotas on immigration, he stood in the shadow of the Statue of Liberty and gestured toward Ellis Island, but the station was already shuttered. So Ellis Island has long been viewed as the central, sometimes even the only, US immigration station, both at the time of its operation and since. Ellis Island has become a sort of shorthand for immigration entry points. So, when Vietnamese refugees arrived in Los Angeles in the 1970s, the New York Times reports that the city has become the Ellis Island of the 1970s. But recognizing the presence of Asians at Ellis Island requires us to recognize that the station was both America's iconic immigration station and its chief deportation depot. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, my presentation will take us back here to Michigan to look at the Arab community in Michigan. And I, again, after Miguel, I would like to thank Liz Huntley for this wonderful statistics. And before that, Hema, a few years ago when you did something similar for Michigan. And what is noticeable about Liz's statistics and Hema before that when you did it is that it's hard to find statistics about Arabs because as far as census is concerned, Arabs are whites. So we don't find accurate statistics about Arabs and Arabic speakers in Michigan. However, Michigan is the place where the largest Arab community in the US lives in one place, in Dearborn, where 40% of the population is of Arab descent or Arab heritage, and where the major high school, public high school, Fordson School, has 95% of its students are Arab heritage. So Michigan, California may have more Arabs in terms of numbers, but Michigan in one concentrated place is the one in the US. My talk is based on ethnographic work that I started in the summer 2014. Unfortunately, I can't go throughout the year, but I go in the summers to Dearborn to do my work, and I look at it through the prism of sociolinguistics methods and tools and anthropology. I would like to make 2 points since I have only 10 minutes. One is we see after September 11, we have 17 years afterwards, we see the tension between the marketization of Arabic in a neoliberal economy and the securitization of Arabic are taking place at the same time. And I think as far as the American institution is concerned, securitization is taking the best of it. We see, the pendulum going towards securitization. But at the same time, Dearborn is a town that demonstrates how viable the Arab community is and the Arabic language is. And so these two tensions exist at the same time. The securitization, I also could talk, if you have questions after my 10 minutes, about my work here at MSU with the Arabic program, and a program that was chosen by the American government, Department of Defense, and given millions of dollars to teach students Arabic to become superior according to the national criteria of proficiency of language. And Michigan State and University of Michigan were chosen because there are many Arabs here in Michigan. And in fact, MSU did not want to do Arabic. They applied for Chinese, but the government said, no, we're not going to give you money for Chinese. We'll give it to Portland State, because there's a Chinese community there, and we'll give you the Arabic. That was the logic. But as the time went, both universities were disconnected from this $1 million grant, and partly because the government's logic moved from the marketization of the heritage speaker. Let's take their language, raise it up a notch, and use them for government jobs, to recruiting only white Americans and preferring white Americans to be in these programs. So also the understanding of the securitization and the proficiency of Arabic has evolved as far as the Department of Defense is concerned. And I'm talking here about millions of dollars that each institute has been given. The second point I want to make is what we see today in regard to the treatment and media treatment, public space treatment of Arabs/Muslim/Arabic is historically bound to the American race struggles. And Arabs have been a community that on the seam line between white and non-white. They were never black, they were never white, but quite white. So in census, we see them being white, but there was always this tension as to how white they were. If we look historically at the waves of Arabs coming to a state like Michigan, demographically, I said Dearborn, 40% of Dearborn is Arab. And these statistics are from HEMA. Thank you, HEMA. A few years ago when you helped us with the research. And also the maps where Arabs live around Dearborn, around the car factories, and to the east of Detroit. And okay, so the first Arabs to come here, late 19th century, from Greater Syria, and to the 1920s, and they worked in peddling, and they're called by researchers such as Michael Suleiman, he's the most known writer about Arabs in the US, sojourners. They worked, collected money, and they always wanted to go back. And so we see generations of Arabs going back, but then their children may have American citizenship. So the children or grandchildren come back to the US. We see back and forth generations of Arabs in the US and in Michigan. But we also see Henry Ford, and we know he was a racist, and he ran his factories like a plantation farm, but he also gave a lot of money compared to other factories. So in 1914, he made it that $5 per day, which equals $120 per day for car factory workers. So we see communities from Syria, Greater Syria, but mostly from Lebanon, although there were also some Palestinians coming and living in this area, Dearborn and Detroit area. And they were identified as Syrian, sometimes Turkish, sometimes even Greek. Their American census of that time doesn't make a distinction between Greek and Arab. They were under one category. So it is really hard to find statistics. But in the 1930s, we see that Arabs start identifying themselves as Arab. And that's partly because of the Arab national movement in the Middle East. It was very strong, and partly because some activists here in the US. And we see that they start organizing themselves, and I just threw the name of Edward Said because he was part of that political organization scene of Arabs in America. But in the 1980s, we see Arabs as starting to identify more with the country of origin. So I am Iraqi, I am Syrian, I'm Lebanese, I'm Egyptian, place of origin, religion, and even sect, Sunni, Shia, and even in Dearborn, they're not living in the same neighborhood. The Sunnis are together, Shiites are together, and also Maronites are in East Detroit, for example, suburbs of East Detroit. So they're not one community, but rather communities. And today, we see even more fragmentation and sometimes intergroup hostility, and I have stories about that too, but due to the time limits, I won't say but with strong organizations. But we do see intergroup hostility, and some of the stuff that's happening in the Middle East, communities fighting there, travels here in the US as well. Linguistic landscape of Michigan is Arab. Arabic is present. This is the airport, for example. And I think it's the only airport where I saw Arabic, because you go to Florida and you see Spanish. You go to San Francisco, you see sometimes Chinese, but Arabic here in Detroit. And Arabic exists, is present in people's homes, how they decorate their homes. This is a Muslim family, so they have Quranic verses in Arabic calligraphy, and this is a Christian family with, in their living room, verses from the Bible in Arabic, in beautiful Arabic calligraphy. Churches, mosques in Dearborn, that's Fordson High School, 95% Arab heritage, and the Arab American National Museum, and it's the only one in the United States. It's in Dearborn. This is from inside the, I just took a picture of this because this is a guy from Syria, I think, and he came earlier in the 20th century, and he is considered here dark complexion. The color is dark, but again, they're not white, but you know, he's identified on this immigration piece as dark. Arabic is everywhere on road signs and shop signs in Dearborn. Very viable, and where community meets. You see all sorts of Arabic advertising different services. I noticed that English and Arabic are not translatable. The Arabic sign says something, and the English sign says something else, and that's part of the marketization, and who the grocer is, you know, who the intended audiences are. For example, this one, in Arabic, you know this is Iraqi food, but you don't know that if you're from Warren, you're a white family from Warren who wants to come and you know, taste Arab food in Dearborn. The same here. You don't know what the national origin is in the English sign, but you know it in Arabic. Museums here in Michigan show a lot of car history. And the car industry, the worker movements, they're nameless. You see just masses of people. This is how they're represented in Henry Ford Museum and also in the museum here in Lansing. But Arabs were a presence, and languages were a presence in Ford factories. I have this one from the, what do you call it, the village? Greenfield Village, Henry Ford's Greenfield. And Arabic is one of the languages that is there, so they want the workers from different language backgrounds to read the sign, and it simply says you need to learn English. That's what the sign says. The securitization, September 11, you know, got the best or the worst out of how the government treats the Arab community. It says, this letter is framed in the Arab American Museum, and it says, your name was brought to our attention because you came to Michigan on a visa from a country where there are groups that support, advocate, or finance terrorist groups, which is not even truthful. The terrorist group was from Saudi Arabia, and the population of Dearborn is from Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Palestine, Egypt, you know, Yemen, but not from Saudi Arabia. And they say also in bold, we have no reason to believe that you are in any way associated with terrorist activities. And this was traumatic for the community, that people were getting these letters from the FBI, and they were, you know, that moment, I call it, I want to cite Louis Althusser's interpellations. They hail you and they, you know, that's your identity, and we're looking at you now with suspicion. So they moved in one instance from being just citizens, just a minority among other minorities in the US, and that moment interpellated the Arab presence in Michigan. And that's the securitization. This is what we get. Donald Trump, and it says in Arabic, can't read this, but he's still afraid of it. That was, I think, on I-50 towards Dearborn, and it was widely spread on Facebook, so I got it. And we see, you know, so when it's the security and the protection of, you know, against securitization, we see Arabic around the state, but this is where we see it. And so again, you know, the 2 points I was trying to make are the tension between marketization and securitization of Arabic, and the second one is about this is part of American racial struggles. We should understand what's going on now as part of it and not outside of it, and but rather so embedded in American history. And I can't say it more eloquently than Dr. Susie, who was here, and she talked about it. I'm not as eloquent, but It's in this line. So these are my 10 minutes. Okay.
First of all, I would like to extend my deepest gratitude to the organizers for giving me this opportunity to participate in this panel. And this has been a very influencing day since morning in my life, looking at different aspects of migration studies and humanities perspective. So the migration group that I am focusing on today is Bhutanese refugees who are resettled in different parts of Michigan, especially. And this started as my involvement as in one of the research projects entitled Citizen Scholars, funded by the College of Arts and Letters at MSU. And one of the components of that project was to visit the non-profit Refugee Development Center, where different refugees are provided with some ESL support, especially the adults. And being a cultural ambassador from Nepal and a graduate student funded by the State Department, I had to do some volunteer work, and I chose to do the ESL tutoring at Lansing Public Library some time ago. And so this merging of different ideas, so it came up there. And then when some of the Bhutanese refugee families invited me to some functions at their homes, and they had prepared dinners and lunch, and so while we were ready to eat, they went and they said, "Do you know that we are not Nepalese and we are Bhutanese?" And so that was a striking point for me. So how the two communities, they are, I come to that point later. So they say they have built a world within another world here. So they are the lack of acceptance from their own ethnic community, and all these ideas brought me to the study of interplay of resettlement, inclusion, and sustainability. So whether it's a salad bowl or a melting pot, and this is an ongoing study. To give a very brief description of how this refugee group started coming to the United States is during the late 1800s, many Nepalese started migrating to Bhutan, and sometime in 1958 they received Bhutanese citizenship, so everything was normal and everything was smooth. But in 1985, when the Bhutanese king revoked their citizenship because he wanted to establish ethnically pure society, so one nation, one people society, so they should all speak Dongkha as their only language, and they should all dress in a certain way. And this made thousands of Bhutanese move back to their ancestral homes. But since they had been living in Bhutan for decades, they were not accepted as the members of the original country, and so they ended up living in the UN camps in southern part of Nepal. For some of the immigrants had been living there for more than 2 decades before they were resettled in the United States. I have a lot of narratives. So the approach that I adopted here is narrative inquiry, and so storytelling, and how through storytelling we could help them navigate through the systems, and then bring out their emotions and settle. As one of the aspects of humanities perspective is, so that emerged from the counseling and then helping people tackle with the ideas. So I'll not focus here on the challenges that they faced when they were being exiled, or when they were during the transitional phase in Nepal for a decade or more, but the challenges that they mainly faced after they were resettled here. So in many of their narratives, they say that they didn't know what it would be like being in the United States, but they knew that it would certainly be better than the place they had been for. And so they faced a lot of challenges. So these are just the themes that emerged from the whole lot of data that I collected from those participants, ranging from teens to adults in their early 60s. So they talk about poverty, the health issues, a lack of education, especially the first generation adult people who came without any education when they were resettled here. And one of the big issues everyone was talking about was the high suicidal rate in the beginning of the resettlement time, especially in 2008, and the nervousness related to newfound language and culture, and it's the whole lot of starting everything from scratch again. And in one of the interviews, so one participant in his early 20s, so she dragged my hand and then she just made me read a part of news forum posted by Anne Corcoran on November 19, 2017, and she was like, we were talking about that, and then I was trying to divert her from that, but then she said, please read this, and then the conversation was a little bit intense after that, and she was reading aloud, and it goes like, new readers may not know that in 2006 the Bush administration said, oh sure, we'll take 60,000 over 5 years of the displaced Bhutanese. We were only supposed to take 60,000 over 5 years, but guess what? We are now up to 94,473. 2,000 more are being processed in nearly 10 years. I'm telling you, once the spigot opens, closing it becomes almost impossible. Just look at the Somalis who we have been admitting for 30 years. And so the discussion went very intense after that, how she is different from her adult group members because she goes to a community college and she thinks that she is trying her best to contribute to the society and to prove to be one of the best Americans, but at the same time this idea of being othered by the news and media is not helping her much. And so there are a lot of frustration stories, but so the main issue that I focused on in my study was this idea of nationhood, citizenship, and belonging. So mainly in terms of their values, the social othering, not only from the groups of the speakers of other languages, but from the speakers of their language itself, from the speakers of Nepali who their ancestors belong to, and ideas of social justice and their individual national and cultural identities. So one of the participants said, we have created a world within a world, within another world, means so Bhutanese within Nepali community, within the whole the United States community. And one adult participant frequently talked about, we don't have borders now, but we have built borders around us because we have our own community, and the co-national and co-ethnic support has been strengthening because of our interrelationships. There have been a lot of resources that have helped them resettle in the beginning days. For example, the non-profit Refugee Development Center, they have established Bhutanese community of Michigan, and which mainly helps the their fellow refugees in transitioning from traumatic lives they spent in refugee camps. And they say that we were always expecting that we would be, we had heard America is a melting pot, but we know that we are never going to melt, and we have accepted that we are a part of that salad bowl where each ingredient is unique, and we want to maintain our identity while accepting the new one. And there is the Association of Bhutanese in America, which aims to maintain their transnational identity and then their practices of translingual practices within and across communities. So my main focus here is these two aspects of how humanities perspective, how I as a graduate student or future academician, how I would adopt humanities approach to look at these issues. And being from a linguistic background and a graduate student of second language studies, so my main focus is on their language loss, language maintenance, and their translingual practices, both use of languages other than their first language, and also different semiotic resources that they adopt within their communication. So the first aspect is this transnational communication, transnational identities, and translanguaging, and also to look at their linguistic, religious, gender, ethnic, cultural identity. So I remember one of the participants saying how his family were supported by a church in the beginning, and how they were so grateful that they started going to weekly Bible study groups, and now they are converted to Christianity. And so how, but at one point his wife was not happy being converted to Christianity, so she still wanted to maintain the original religious identity that they all belong to Hinduism. And my last point, the second one, is I really like this idea of being responsive to the immigrant communities, and as we have been discussing since morning, so how we approach humanistic approach or humanities theory. For me, the main idea behind this, one of the main ideas behind this, is letting them consciously choose, or let's say consciously make use of their free will to help them self-actualize their identities or other any other aspects of their life here, and to create an environment where they could grow themselves. And my main focus was on two aspects: acceptance and empathy with unconditional positive regard. And so this is ongoing study, and my major concern is how I have seen those adults who are not educated and who say that they have created a border. They are with borders but without borders at the same time, and they stay home all the time because of the lack of their language, and their grandchildren playing the role of language brokers at home between their parents and then other people and then their grandparents. And I remember one old senior citizen saying, "I am sitting in a golden wheelchair." So it is golden in the sense that I'm in a better position than I was before, but it's a wheelchair, so I cannot walk because of the lack of proficiency in English, so I cannot work and all these things. And as Dr. Gentila mentioned this morning, so one of my prospective research concerns could be, despite all these stories, there have been, it's not the scenario that all immigrants who have been resettled have only sad stories to share. There have been some examples who are thriving in their areas, in their personal and academic lives. They are involved in business sectors and promoting educational and other developments of their fellow refugees. So eliciting their stories of the thrivers to inspire others could be a part in the future. Thank you so much.